Say your plant looks like this, bare roots and no soil. To know exactly what pot size you should pick, take the roots, gently compact them to see how much volume they actually take up. Because I can compact my roots to such a small size, I need to pick a pot that is slightly larger than the volume of my roots. The purpose of this is to have roots that establish faster into a comfortable wet and dry cycle. With a smaller pot and less volume of soil, the roots can suck up water at a much more reasonable pace. If you go with a much larger pot, you risk your roots staying wet for too long and potentially suffering root damage. This is an indoor plant channel, and because of typical indoor conditions, most people have significantly lower light levels. In low light, your roots don't work as hard, and you can have really slow water uptake. So with lots of excess soil and lower light levels, these are the two things that put most people's plants in danger. And it's these two things that are the main contributing factors to root rot. So while your plant dries out in a smaller size pot, you can water it again sooner, and this will help your roots establish faster. To ensure you're watering on the right schedule, you can use a moisture meter or a wooden stick to stick all the way to the bottom of the soil of your pot. And this is the best way to see if your soil is actually dry. The finger test might work on smaller plants, but if you have a deeper pot, you're going to have no idea how wet the soil actually is past the first 1 or 2 inches. If you're looking to repot a plant that's already established in soil and your roots look something like this, the general accepted rule is to put it in a plant pot that is 2 inches larger than its original size. I personally have been recommending that people wait until their plant's roots take up about 80% of the soil in the pot, and this tends to help with an easier transition into its new space. Select a new pot size, layer a bit of the bottom with new soil, and put it directly into the new pot. Unless you're working with trees or plants that have a taproot, you do not need to untangle any of the roots. Remember to fill in the rest of your spaces with your soil mix and water your plant. While these are not absolutes to follow, I'll give you the 3 main reasons why I give this advice, especially for beginners with their houseplants. I grow my houseplants indoors, and I always suggest that you get a light meter so you can have a deeper understanding of what the light levels are actually like in your home. If you've ever used a light meter or a light meter app, you probably won't be surprised to know how low the light levels in your house can actually get. Even a heavily shaded outdoor area can have so much more light than what we think might be a well-lit room indoors. In low light, we slow down plants' functions. We slow down how fast they can take up water through their roots. With our low light indoor plants that stay too wet for too long, we set those up for root death and failure with our plants. Most people are not checking to see how often they should water their plants. I've put plants in great soil and appropriately sized pots, but deliberately put them in low lighting, and they've managed to stay wet for longer than 3 weeks. If you're mostly looking at AI overviews, it's mostly telling people to water their plants once a week. Combined with AI telling you that you should do the finger test, this is really setting up people for failure. Their plants are not drying out, they're watering too frequently, and they're getting root rot. I'll say it again, getting a moisture meter or a wooden stake is a much more reliable way to make sure that your plant is actually drying out. The density of your soil also affects how much water it can hold. Basic Miracle-Gro soil can hold a ton of moisture, but adding amendments like perlite can really help with drainage. Even just adding 50% perlite to your standard potting mix can make it have a much faster wet and dry cycle. If you deeply understand those 3 reasons, you can know exactly when to strategically ignore my advice, pick larger pot sizes, change your soil mix, and still have successful plants. Here's an example of what following my advice exactly really looks like. I'm going to start with this lipstick plant that needs repotting. I've used a light meter to assess that this plant is in relatively normal, lower light conditions indoors. More specifically, it's at around 100 foot candles, and it doesn't really get much higher than 200 foot candles at its peak. Now, there is a small grow light above this plant, but most of it is being blocked out by my Marble Queen pothos. You need to be ready with your potting mix, maybe some gloves, and a pot that is 1 to 2 inches larger than this current size. This lipstick plant is in a 4-inch pot, so the next size upgrade is a 6-inch pot. I'm going from plastic to plastic. Once your plant comes out of your old pot, it's important to remember that you do not need to unravel or take apart any of the roots, but if there is any old or dead foliage at the base, like there is a lot with this plant, you can just take that off. I've never actually changed the original potting soil that this plant came with, so it's mostly in a peat-based typical potting soil mixed with a little bit of perlite mixed in. You can think about your typical Miracle-Gro. One thing I like to do is just to double check that your new pot size will fit your old plant, and I like to see how much extra soil that this might take up. You can see that going from a 4-inch to a 6-inch does seem like it can be a little bit big. You'll notice that the roots of the lipstick plant, they're pretty fine, and because of that, I try to do my best to avoid having large size particles in with my new soil. So large size perlite or large size orchid bark, I try to avoid. You'll basically just need a typical potting mix mixed with perlite. When your roots are really fine like this, if there's a lot of open air pockets inside the actual soil, the roots will have a higher chance of drying out. With my potting mix, I want to layer the bottom of the plant first. Again, doing my best to try to avoid some of the larger size perlite that have snuck their way into my soil. I'm not sifting through this or anything like that. Once I have around 1/2 inch to 1 inch of new potting soil at the bottom of my pot, I will put this plant inside and I'll double check to see that the height of the plant is not exceeding the height of my pot. And this is getting pretty close to that first lip on the inside. So if I want to leave some extra space, I can take out a little bit of potting soil. Shake it around to adjust, and then now it sits a little bit deeper inside the pot. From here, the next thing to do is start backfilling your soil, getting all around the edges. Be careful not to bury too much of the top of the plant, because when these stem sections are covered in soil, it does expose them to higher chances of rotting, getting stem rot, and other bacterial infections. If your plant is healthy, you really do not need to be super gentle. And depending on how much light you're getting, light is the thing that helps these plants recover from any stress of repotting. And now with my repot finished, the only thing I need to do now is water my plant. You want to make sure never to just repot your plant into dry soil and leave it like that. If the roots are touching the dry soil, you can imagine it like rubbing up against a rough surface, which can actually harm the roots. If your plant was already soaking wet when you repotted it and you're a little bit worried about causing additional damage to that by watering it again, one strategy that you can do is take your soil, make sure that soil is a little bit damp, and then take the damp soil and use that to repot your plant. If you do that, you won't have to drench it again. You can just wait for it to dry out on its typical schedule, whatever that may be. A good example of when you might want to ignore my instructions is when your plant might look something like this. You've assessed your plant's conditions. Maybe it's in generally higher light next to a large window, and maybe on top of that you have it exposed to additional grow lights. For example, this philodendron tortum that is way overdue for a repot. I know that this plant receives around 1,000, likely more, foot candles for around 4 hours of the day. Right now I'm taking a reading at around 600 foot candles, and this is on an extremely cloudy day. On top of that, this Soltec Vita bulb gives around 6 hours of additional light exposure, 3 in the morning and 3 after the sun goes down. So what I want to do now is I want to go from this 4-inch non-standard plastic pot to an 8-inch terracotta upgrade. Okay, so the pot size upgrade of 4 extra inches is pretty big, but the reason why I'm doing that is because this plant is so out of control. I also need to add a support stake in here because it used to just be on this really tiny bamboo stick that's obviously not doing anything anymore. I'm ready with my wooden stake that I'm going to have on a slightly backwards angle, and I'm going to make sure that I get as many of these larger size perlite pieces that I can, because when you're going from a smaller pot with low soil mass to a larger pot with a lot of extra soil mass, this pot is going to retain a lot more moisture for a lot longer. So you want to make sure that you retain a lot of those oxygen pockets. I'm going to try to be super careful with this because the stem at the bottom of this plant is super thin, and if it snaps, it's going to cut off all the access to the water and nutrients to the top of the plant. The smart thing to do would be to cut the top off of this and reroot it in water, but what I'm going to do is bury it a little bit deeper, getting some access to some of these aerial roots that are up higher. These aerial roots will grow into the soil, and that will provide all of the water and nutrients to the top part of the plant. I'm going to go slow and gentle, but by holding the petiole and the stake together, I think I can use my other hand to fill in all the extra soil around, which will stabilize it. And then once it's stable, I'll go in with some plant ties to make sure that the plant is not moving, so it can be super secure. I just have to fill in a little bit higher on the soil, more than I'm usually comfortable with, to make sure that the other aerial roots lower down on that stem can make contact with the wet soil. I'm tying one petiole to the stake for now. I will release it soon, but getting at the stem on this tortum is actually kind of challenging because of how crooked it is, but once it's secure, it should actually be fine. Add a little bit of slow release fertilizer, and again, make sure to water your plant. If you follow these rules and you know exactly when to ignore them, you'll almost always have a perfectly successful repot. Oh, and you can watch some of these other videos here if you want to learn more. Okay, bye.